I'm Wendy Chamberlain. I'm president of the Middle East Institute, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to this very special and very timely event this afternoon. MEI is honored to have partnered with the American Academy of Political and Social Science on their most recent edition of the Academy's journal, the ANNALS. This collaborative work we will launch and we will discuss this afternoon. It's a collection of essays, policy, and advice and counsel to the next administration on how to handle issues of terrorism and homeland security. The work was edited by MEI's board chairman and former special assistant to the president and former national coordinator for counterterrorism, Richard A. Clark. Other contributors to this collective work will also be joining us on the panel today. Include cybersecurity expert Emilian Papadopoulos, Randy Beers, who is another MEI board member and former special advisor to the president and former acting deputy secretary for Homeland Security, as well as MEI's vice president for policy and research, Dr. Paul Salem. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, that the next administration will inherit one of the most challenging foreign policy situations in the Middle East in decades, certainly in my lifetime, and that's a very long time. The region is in violent transition. Civil wars in Syria and Libya and Yemen have really pushed these states into the situation of being failed states. Lebanon and Iraq are certainly extremely fragile. Iran's regional ambitions have aggravated underlying Sunni-Shia tensions. All of this forms the context for the rise of non-state terrorist organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And this Middle East instability has threatened some of the United States' most important allies. The refugee flow and the immigration flow caused by instability in the Middle East has undermined EU security and unity. It's created space for Russian adventurism, and these are some of the issues that will be tackled in the annals. Before we begin, I'd like to just mention that the Middle East Institute's annual conference is scheduled for November 16. It's our 70th. Also a little older than I am, I'm happy to say. And the day before, please sign up for both. But if you could support what we're doing at the Middle East Institute, we welcome you to sign up for our banquet the night before on the 16th. You can do so online. But the banquet will be really, really fun this year. It's being hosted, emceed by the Egyptian satirist Bassem Youssef. And we will be honoring Syria, the heroes of Syria, the white helmets. These are the guys that you see on television that are pulling babies out of rubble in Aleppo. We will also be honoring the mayor of Bethlehem, Vera Baboun. I want to keep the focus on the Palestinians. It somehow seems to get lost sometimes here in Washington, but we will be doing that as well. And if you can't come to the dinner the night before and you still want to see Bassem Youssef, go online and buy a ticket to the luncheon in the midday of our conference, because Bassem Youssef will be interviewed by the hilarious David Litt. He's a former speechwriter and joke writer for President Obama. Tickets are going fast. Hope you can make both events that are coming up. And now I'd like to get on with the program. I know you're anxious to hear our panel, but first I'd like to introduce Tom Ketchkasmith. I blew it. Ketchkasmith. Tom is Executive Director of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and he will make a few welcoming remarks as well. So, again, thank you all for coming.
Good day. It's Tom Ketchkasmith. That's all right. and I take nothing personally. Thanks so much, Wendy, and thanks very much to MEI, particularly Mark Sheelan and his staff for bringing this thing together so smoothly. It's not often that we do a lot of events like this in collaboration with a lot of different outfits, and it's not often that we do one where everything goes as smoothly as this, so thanks to Mark and his staff. I'm executive editor of an academic journal called the Annals of the American Academy. Greetings from Philadelphia, where we've kept our home for 125 years. We are a broadly interdisciplinary title. So we have a long history in foreign affairs, but we also do a lot of domestic policy relevant work through the Annals. So I skate from topic to topic to topic as executive editor on a bi-monthly basis. So the Annals in its current form, every issue, being a special edited issue on a matter of particular importance to the nation, has existed for 125 years, well, about 100 years in its current form, all bi-monthly. So there are a lot of really rich and interesting collections of work on contemporary, at the time, social challenges in the Annals. And this volume is a volume of the Annals that was released on Friday. It's available online. It's also available to you free and open. You have to get past the Sage paywall to look at the content right now. But special just for you, we have a link where you can go and get the online content. So it's long, it's on the flyer. My colleague Jessica Erfer over here and I are happy to provide you that access. If you want, just reach out to us. The most important work that we do at the Academy, well, the Academy exists to advance social science in the public sphere and to make the power of social research and evidence available to public policymakers and to the general public. The most important way that we do this is through that journal. I've told you that it's broadly interdisciplinary, and I've told you that we have a strong history in foreign affairs. The story of this volume couldn't have been easier. When I came into this job a few years ago, I noted that 8 years ago, Dick Clark edited a briefing for the next president, published as a collection of work in the Annals on terrorism. So it didn't take too much sense to revisit this 8 years later. So about a year and a few months ago, I reached out to Dick, just cold called him. We didn't know each other. And he, from my perspective, kind of leapt at the opportunity to bring together another collection of work published as a set of academic papers on this topic. So thank you very much to Dick for being such a great colleague and being willing to do this. So that's the story of the volume of the journal. The story of this session is just about as easy. I was talking to Dick a few weeks ago about the journal and the release, and Emilian. Hi, Emilian. We didn't get to say hi. Talking to Dick and Emilian a few weeks ago about this volume and about how we might push this content out to interested parties, and it just couldn't have been easier than working through MEI to do this session. So it's my job to introduce the panel, and I'll move on to that right now. Richard Clark, as you all know, is chairman of Good Harbor Security Risk Management and also chairman of the Middle East Institute. As we all know, he's an expert on cybersecurity, homeland security, national security, having served as senior White House advisor to 3 presidents, including the post of special advisor to the president for cybersecurity, national coordinator for security and counterterrorism, and special assistant to the president for global affairs. He's a prolific writer and an on-air consultant for ABC News on terrorism and cybersecurity. A few weeks ago when we were meeting, Dick and I were meeting about this volume, and I told him that I sort of professed that I'm something of a fanboy and told him that I was honored to be working with him on this. He said, "Don't be. It's not your call, Dick. I am." So thank you very much for all the work you put in on this. Emilian Papadopoulos is president of Good Harbor Security Risk Management, a firm that advises boards, CEOs, and executives on cybersecurity risk. He's advised clients in the Middle East on national security, counterterrorism, and urban security. Previously, he was a political and economic officer with Foreign Affairs Canada, and he is co-editor of this Annals volume. And I have to say that Emilian has been our principal point of contact for everything in this volume and has been helping to make sure that the trains run on time with my colleague and managing editor. So thanks, Emilian, for all the work that you put into this. Paul Salem is Vice President for Policy and Research at the Middle East Institute, where his work focuses on political change across the Middle East region, and particularly in the Levant and Egypt. He's author of numerous books, reports, and articles on issues of political change, transition, and conflict, as well as the regional and international relations of the Middle East. Prior to his work at MEI, Paul was a founding director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Notably, vis-a-vis this session, he's edited the first section of the Annals. The volume is split into two parts, and it was was the first. That section is on regional transition, failed states, failing states, the current condition of Islamist extremism in the region, and the politics of the current milieu. Rand Beers. He is a senior fellow at MEI and on faculty at Dartmouth College, which is his alma mater. Previously, he was Deputy Homeland Security Advisor to President Obama and acting Secretary of Homeland Security following the resignation of Janet Napolitano. He served on national security councils for 4 presidents and is a renowned expert on the identification and mitigation of threats to U.S. national security. With respect to this morning's conversation, he was editor, or the curator really, of Section 2. Section 2 of this volume is fascinating. At least it was extraordinarily illuminating to me. It's on the it's on the emerging and increasingly robust field of CVE, countering violent extremism, and it's an interesting collection of case studies and academic papers. So that covers our panel, I think, and with that, I'll hand things off to Mary Louise Kelly, who is our moderator this morning and a familiar voice to so many of us on matters of foreign affairs, intelligence, and national security. Mary Louise is a national security correspondent at NPR, where she has a long history and has had many jobs. Mary Louise makes it her business to keep us informed about the increasingly complicated world of security and intelligence on the national stage. Her reporting is remarkable in lots of ways. Here, I'll mention only 2. First, she is obviously crazy smart, and she uses that native intelligence to great advantage as she reports stories in ways that not only inform us, but enlighten us. Second, her work makes evident that there are a great many things that reporters do well, and she has one of them. The reports that she reports the news, but she does it in a way that makes us smarter by conveying texture, background, and nuance along with a contemporary story. It's a tough trick to pull off well. She certainly does it, and I, for one, am very pleased that she's lent her voice to this panel and gives us her outlook on foreign affairs and the intelligence scene. Mary Louise is also a novelist, adjunct professor at Georgetown, and contributing editor at The Atlantic. In other words, she and the rest of our panelists are the sorts of folk who are gifted at making the rest of us feel like slackers. So, Mary Louise, thanks for taking the time to do this, and the panel's yours.
Tom, thank you. That was such a nice introduction. I fear the afternoon can only go downhill from here. So if y'all want to grab a sandwich and call it a day, I'm in. I will share that as I was racing over here on my way out of the NPR newsroom, I stopped at my editor's desk to remind him that I was heading out and would be out of pocket for a couple of hours. And he said, "Oh yeah, it's a panel. What is it on again?" And I said, "Well, it's terrorism, countering violent extremism, and failed states in the Middle East." And he went, yeah, but you can wrap that up and be back in time to file by 2, right? So that is my expectation. In the next 90 minutes, we're going to solve Middle East peace and win the war on terror. It is a pleasure to be here. When I got the call from Dick to moderate this, he pitched it as, this is a playbook for the next president. And I thought, I want to hear that, so absolutely, count me in. We were discussing, my fellow panelists, before we sat down today. You heard mention of the effort to put a similar playbook together 8 years ago, and we were all conferring and thinking what a very different world it was, what a very different playbook that was for the Obama administration when it came into the White House 8 years ago. I mean, for purposes of our discussion, if you think about it, in 2008, there was no Arab Spring that had reconfigured the Middle East. There was no Iran nuclear deal in place. None of us had heard of ISIS because it didn't exist. So we are in a very different world, and our challenge for the next coming up to 90 minutes is framing where we are now and what lessons the administration should take going in, and where we might all hope to be 4 years from now when we gather here again. My hope for the session is that if we don't quite solve Middle East peace and defeat global terrorism, that we will, all of us, walk away with an insight or two that helps us sharpen the way that we are all framing these issues. So my plan is I'd love to ask each of the panelists to kick us off with very short, maybe 2 minutes, framing remarks of how you are thinking about these issues, what the big questions in your mind are, and what you hope people might be thinking about as a takeaway. And I'll let each of the four of you do that, and then I'll pitch in with some questions. Then we'll open it up to all of yours, and we'll get you all out of here by 1:30 sharp. So that is the plan. Dick, let me turn to you first, and then I'll come to you, Rand, and then we'll maybe work our way down to the side of the panel next. Please.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for moderating. When I think back to the volume we did 8 years ago, the briefing book for the President on terrorism that we did with the Annals 8 years ago, it was a remarkably different world, as you said. And I'm not sure any of the recommendations in that volume were taken, but about half of the authors went into the White House to do the next administration management. So we do in this volume have a lot of specific recommendations, which is something we didn't do 8 years ago. And there's a section in the book where you can look at the recommendations. We didn't think we could just raise issues and problems because the next president will know what those issues and problems are. What she'll be looking for is specifically what are the recommendations, what do you do about it? And the difference between 8 years ago and now and how we conceive of the problem is reflected in the volume itself. It is two overlapping problems in our mind, which was not something that we thought of, not the way we thought of it 8 years ago. One problem, which half of the book is about, is failed states in the Middle East. We had 1 or 2 failed states in the Middle East 8 years ago. Now we have 6 or 7. And they're not going to unfail anytime soon. They're not going to be successful anytime soon. Even if cities like Mosul and eventually Raqqa are taken, they're not going to be rebuilt anytime soon. So we have an environment in which terrorism and the sources of terrorism will thrive, even if the cities are retaken. So one distinct problem, failed states. Another distinct problem, the ideology. And what the 9/11 Commission called the battle of ideas, what we now call countering violent extremism. Obviously, the failed states act upon the ideology and vice versa, but we think there's a separate issue of how do you go after the ideology that is so appealing. It's a mystery to us sometimes why it is, but an ideology that is so appealing to young, disaffected Arab youth, both in the Middle East and in Europe and North America. So we've conceived of it as 2 different problems. We've tried to address it as 2 different problems.
Rand.
Thank you. So in the same frame, if you look back to 9/11 and the years after 9/11 leading up to 2008, I think the most prominent thing you would have reflected on was the effort to prevent individuals from overseas coming into the United States and performing another horrific act as 9/11 was. There was also occasional events that occurred in this country, like Hassan Nadal's shooting at Fort Hood or the failed bombing in Times Square. But by and large, we were looking at a major effort on the part of the administration to prevent individuals coming in to the United States from overseas, and domestically, we were focused primarily on FBI investigations that were conducted here in the United States to try to see whether or not they were able to uncover individuals who were looking to perform acts within this country. If you go forward to today, and this is even since we conceived of this volume, there were 94 individuals who were killed in the United States by domestic violent extremisms from 9/11 to today. 63 of those died in the last year since San Bernardino. San Bernardino, the Orlando nightclub shooting, and then New York, New Jersey, and St. Cloud. If you look at the number of injured people, it's 115 since that event in San Bernardino. What we have here now, and what makes this particular part of the volume so timely, is that the degree of violence in terms of mass casualties and the anxiety of the American people on what might happen domestically have both risen dramatically. And what we try to do in the second half of the volume is put forward some ideas on how to deal with this problem, not solely from the perspective of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Law Enforcement, but to look at other solutions that seek to find individuals before they're radicalized or while they may be in the process of radicalization, and seeing whether or not we can prevent that final mobilization to violence. So I think this is particularly timely.
Thank you. The section I helped put together is a number of very interesting chapters that I would encourage you to read online. One by Mark Lynch on failed states and ungoverned spaces, one by Charles Lister on the competition between ISIS and Al-Qaeda and what dynamic that brings about, one by the Princeton professor Bernard Heikel on the thinking and ideology of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, chapter by General John Allen on thinking long-term about grand strategy in facing and defeating extremism on the long term, and my own chapter on the importance of building or rebuilding regional order. In our section, we try to look at the intersection between events in the Middle East and U.S. interests and U.S. policy. The Middle East is going through a perfect storm of dysfunction, a broken regional order, a proxy war between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other players, a number of broken states, as Dick mentioned, broken states or brittle states on the verge of breaking. That is partly the result of proxy war, but also creates vacuums that also fuels terrorism and fuels proxy conflict. In addition, underlying stress factors, high demographic growth, high unemployment, youth bulge, impacts of climate change, as well as intense ideological competition, not only within Shiite or between Shiites and Sunnis, but within the Sunni world itself, between Islamists and secularists, Islamists and nationalists. The perfect storm, we look back a bit, created partly by the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the still ongoing aftermath of that, and the uprisings of 2011, which helped sort of destabilize and bring down a lot of states in the region. We try to look at the intersection of those dramatic events with U.S. interests, identifying three main U.S. interests: free flow of oil, stopping the spread of weapons of mass destruction, and fighting terrorism. And one would say the first two are doing okay, and the third under this administration has gone from bad to worse. So obviously an enormous focus for the next president, not so much on oil, not so much on stopping the spread of WMD in the Middle East, the nuclear deals, as well as the chemical weapons deal with Syria. Previously, Libya gave up its programs, so that's sort of been attended to. So very much for the next administration, an enormous focus on the threat of terrorism. From there, we look at some of the models of how the U.S. Has dealt with things. Some say the Bush administration did too much, the Obama administration did too little. Is there sort of a Goldilocks middle? But we come down saying it's not really how much you do, but it's what you do. And we looked at a number of models. The U.S. used to be the offshore balancer, largely during the Cold War. But interestingly, when the Cold War ended, the U.S. moved troops into the region, the first Gulf War in 1990, imposed a dual containment, and sort of was on the ground, not as an offshore balancer, but sort of an onshore policeman. If we look at the George W. Bush years, it went from onshore policeman to transformative hegemon, trying to change the region. in some sort of pro-Western democratic way that failed. And under the Obama administration, there's been an attempt to go back to offshore balancer, but it's really been more offshore and unbalanced. And the problem there is offshore balancer requires that the region be somewhat balanced to maintain, there's something to maintain, and there is nothing to maintain. You cannot maintain a proxy war. You fuel a proxy war. You need to create stability first. And secondly, offshore balancer assumes you're balancing states. Whereas currently in the Middle East, armed non-state actors, whether they're the main terrorist ones that we focus on, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, or major non-state armed groups like Hezbollah or the Popular Mobilization Units, or many rebel groups in Libya, Syria, and Yemen, you cannot balance non-state actors. It requires a different approach. So in the various chapters, different authors present different approaches, but I would summarize some of the main sort of headlines to the next administration. Some are rather obvious. It's not sort of reinventing the wheel, but obviously the most short-term and urgent is continuing to attempt to defeat ISIS and then figure out how to confront Al-Qaeda, which is deeply embedded, particularly in Syria and somewhat in Yemen. Secondly, and this maybe can build on the nuclear deal with Iran, the essential goal of trying to rebuild some regional order. That unless we can get Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, a number of the other players to walk back from proxy war, we are not going to be able to stop civil wars. You're not going to be able to rebuild failed states, and you're not going to be able to defeat terrorist groups which feed off the sectarian proxy war. So looking at attempts to de-escalate and to move this region towards regional stability has to be probably the sort of the broadest goal. The Middle East has been here before. Saudi Arabia and Egypt waged proxy war throughout most of the 50s and 60s. Arab Israelis waged numerous wars in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But those conflicts have sort of transformed into more stability. East Asia went from conflicts, as did Europe, and so on. It is doable. Third goal, going back to the more mundane, paying acute attention to ending the civil wars and maintaining a vigorous role. Secretary Kerry has been very active, but it needs to be backed up maybe with more support from the next White House. And finally, helping to rebuild the failed states. This is obviously Syria, Libya, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria. This is not something that the U.S. should or can do alone, but the U.S. still has the main leadership role globally, and the next administration should figure out how to help marshal that leadership capacity to bring wars to an end and to help build a more stable region. Thank you.
Thank you.
So when the request to do this volume first came in to Dick and he shared it with me and Paul and Rand, I think my first reaction was, oh my goodness, it's been 8 years since we did the last one. And I couldn't believe that that much time had passed. And so that got me thinking as we edited this entire volume about time and time frames. And so I'll just reinforce a little bit, Mary Louise, of what you already said. 4 years, or in the best case scenario, 8 years, is simultaneously, as we look at the volume, a very, very long time, and that a lot can change, and the circumstances the president is facing can change tremendously. If we look at 2000 to 2008, or 08 to 16, in terms of what the world looked like and what the president was trying to deal with, it's time for a lot of change. On the other hand, 4 years is actually an extraordinarily short period of time to achieve anything. The Syria conflict has been going for longer than a presidential administration. The Iran nuclear deal took over the course of 2 terms to really negotiate. If you start with kind of the slowing down of Iran's nuclear program through cyber means and then getting to a deal. What I love about what the authors did in all the chapters is that because it was structured as a briefing book to the president, they didn't just analyze the problem. They didn't just analyze the problem and say, where do we want to be in 10 or 20 years? They actually laid out fairly specific recommendations of what can be achieved in, let's assume, 4 years. And so several of the authors gave, as an example, Mark Lynch in one of Paul Salem's chapters says that what we could reasonably hope to achieve in a lot of cases of the conflicts in the Middle East is to get to ceasefires, to get to a de facto partitioning of territory and a reduction of conflict, not necessarily solving all the political problems, not necessarily getting to a final answer. And I think that that's important because if you pretend that you can solve the entire problem in 4 years, you'll probably adopt the wrong strategy. So I think the recommendations from the authors are good because they're time limited and they're realistic things you can do within 4 years. At the same time, that doesn't mean that they're not ambitious. And several of the authors recommend major economic investment. Several of the authors recommend major humanitarian initiatives that you can start within 4 years and you absolutely don't expect to see the outcomes within that period of time. So I think the authors, and I'll second what Paul said, to go online, check out each of the articles and read the author's recommendations, but they really tried to give ambitious and urgent, but short-term and concrete recommendations. And that's, I think, one of the values of the volume.
Thank you. Thanks to all four of you. Well, I hope that the theme of recommendations and looking ahead and looking towards solutions gets threaded through our whole conversation today. I want to start with two big picture framing questions. One to do with how we define the threat, one to do with how we define US goals. And let me start with the first in terms of defining how we should think about the threat. I'm going to throw this one to you first, Rand. As I talk to people in your world who've cycled in and out of government, I have had more than one recently quote me the scene, I don't know if y'all remember this, from the James Bond movie, Casino Royale. Do y'all remember this is Judi Dench, who's playing the head of MI6, and she comes storming through, I think she's at Parliament, and she's talking about Russia, and she says, "Christ, I miss the Cold War." And I've had people quote that to me in the context of, God, I miss Al-Qaeda in the days after 9/11. Not that anyone misses Al-Qaeda in the days after 9/11, but there was something more straightforward in terms of our understanding of a more hierarchical threat. And I wonder if you would kick us off by, how do you think about the threat? How do you define terrorism in 2016?
The question that I think that we have all struggled with. It is pretty clear, I think, if you go back only 4 years, we were only beginning to appreciate that the Islamic State was moving in a significant way on the horizon. And the administration, quite frankly, was still focused on Al-Qaeda as the primary enemy and the various hotspots. But as Syria dissolved and as Iraq returned to being a confrontation issue, the country has had to face the fact that there is a significant new player in the terrorism arena. And then as that has evolved, we've had to face the fact that their ability to mobilize people outside of Syria and Iraq, in Western Europe, in other places in the Middle East and the Arab world more broadly, and in the United States, has changed this in a very significant way. And I think that as the administration has faced this, trying to understand how the Islamic State is able to do what it has in projecting terrorism outside of the regions in which it's located has represented an important and significant problem. And as I think the president would quite clearly say, we're going to have to fix the issue at home as well as overseas, because the American public has reason to question what's going on in our own country.
And how quickly does the threat continue to evolve? I just put that question to Joby Warwick recently, who some of y'all will know covers terrorism for the Washington Post, just won the Pulitzer for his book on ISIS. And he said, 2016, you look at it, ISIS is having a really lousy year and a really great year at the same time. And, 4 years from now, are we going to be talking about ISIS? Are we going to be talking about Al-Qaeda? Will it look very different? Feel free to jump in.
Go ahead.
I think we'll be talking about both. I don't think Al-Qaeda has gone away. 15 years after 9/11, it's actually grown in the strength in the last 5 years. And in ways that are sometimes not readily apparent to Western intelligence and Western media. So, for example, Al-Qaeda has gained strength in the slums of Karachi and in Central Africa, two places where we hadn't seen it when it was the threat. Daesh isn't going away either. They're giving up the cities, but they will spread. And as Charles Lister says in his chapter, we're actually going to have a competition. We already have between Daesh and Al Qaeda, and which will cause them to not only compete for adherence, but to compete in who can outdo the other in terrible terrorist attacks. So I don't expect another group to appear in the next 4 to 8 years, but I think we will see the way in which the attacks occur and where they occur continue to morph.
And how does the continuing morphing of the threat, how does that change how the U.S. should respond as we're looking at recommendations? I mean, I was struck by your opening comments, Rand, talking about, back in 2001, the focus was on stopping bad guys from entering the U.S. That's a very different way from the way we talk about the threat now.
I think that that's true, and I think that the Bush and Obama administrations deserve some important credit for trying to prevent foreign terrorists from coming into the United States. The number of individuals who have been found in the U.S. Who have come from overseas recently, and I mean who are refugees or the like, is a very small number, 2 or 3. But the number of individuals who have been mobilized in the United States is quite significant. So I think that what we're going to see is as the second half of the book focuses, an administration that is going to have to figure out a better way than relying simply upon law enforcement to solve problems domestically. I mean, let me just make a very simple point. If you look at the cases that have been prosecuted in the United States, or individuals who have died who have had a investigation of their mobilization within this country, almost every one of them had some kind of behavioral pattern that was observable to either their family members, to their friends, or to institutional leaders like teachers or imams. And they were not reported because people weren't sure that they knew what they were seeing, people were in denial, and people were reluctant because the only way to report somebody seemed to be to law enforcement, and they weren't sure they wanted to get that other person involved in a law enforcement investigation. Whereas if we think about this more, some people call it a public health issue. If we think about it as looking at these individuals as possibly being identified and diverted from radicalization, then we have a better chance of creating a broader base of public safety. And I think that's where the administration, in this administration, is trying to go, and I think that's going to be the big challenge for the next administration. How do you do that?
Please.
Just on that, also, if you look at sort of the right after 9/11 and where we are now, I mean, in the 9/11 world, it really was hierarchical. There was an organization which was organizing and commanding. We are definitely now in a multicellular framework, meaning not only is there Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but this, self-organizing, and whether it's various groups or even individuals, has become the model and has become the operational challenge. Secondly, obviously, which Rand has written on a lot, and as well as others, is the completely much more viral social media and communication world we're in. For 9/11, they had to send actual people, train them somewhere, pay them. It was a sort of old-fashioned way of doing it, whereas now this threat permeates through not only the internet, but all the social media and the sort of the infrastructure that we have. And that makes identifying and confronting and limiting the damage from these types of threats extremely difficult and probably impossible to avoid altogether, because it's almost now part of the environment we live in.
I wonder whether you all think that thinking in Washington, that government approaches have caught up with the changing nature of the threat. I mean, in the days after 9/11, as we all know, many, many billions were spent revamping the intelligence community and on big kinetic items, drone strikes, putting air marshals on every flight, no-fly list, things, tangible things. The kind of community efforts that you're talking about are clearly in line with the direction of where the threat is heading, and yet is that where Congress and the White House are focused in addressing this? Okay. Amelia, you want to jump in?
I'm going to give a quick pause on that and just come back to the prior question, but I think it still segues well. Just to add to the prior question, the topic of foreign fighters returning home, which I think is one of the ways that we could reasonably expect to see the threat change significantly over the next 4 to 8 years. So there are, one of the things that Daesh has done, even more than Al-Qaeda, is to attract foreign fighters from a much larger number of countries. They've been there, they've been learning, they've been radicalized and learning tactics to execute attacks for a number of years. At the same time, Daesh has tried very, very hard to keep foreign fighters who wanted to leave from leaving. And I think it's reasonable to argue that as ISIS loses territory, as they lose momentum, you could see many of their foreign fighters wanting to leave and actually being successful in doing that, returning home to countries in the region, returning home to Europe, returning home to North America. And so I think that will change the threat that the US, where I'm from Canada, and Europe are facing significantly. And so we can take that maybe and come back to the question of what government is doing to adapt to that.
No, I think if you compare some of the chapter headings from 8 years ago to chapter headings this year, it kind of answers your question, because 8 years ago we were worried about the counterterrorism infrastructure. Did we have enough intelligence capability of the right sort? Were we doing information sharing of the right sort? Did we need more things at airports and whatnot? Those questions, I think, aren't asked anymore, because thankfully, through the good work of people like Rand and our colleagues at the FBI, we actually haven't had a significant problem in the United States since 9/11. And that's not because people haven't tried. So whatever happened after 9/11 domestically, and I've been very critical of it as excessive and wasteful, somewhere buried in all of that money, there was a successful program. And you do have to find it. And I think the next president might want to think about, and this is very risky politically, but might want to think about trying to find that successful program and getting rid of some of the excess, because there's a lot of excess and a lot of wasteful bureaucracy and a lot of unnecessary programming. Somewhere, though, there were things that worked to stop attacks in the United States, at least the large-scale attacks in the United States. And so I think now what we need to think about is, rather than that infrastructure, it's the substance. It's the substance of the approach. And how do you change the mind of that person who, as Rand said, is thinking of being radicalized or has been radicalized but is about to become violent? You can't get into that decision-making cycle. If somebody is already radicalized, one day they can be violent the next day. And you can't know when that mental switch is going to be flipped, when they're going to move from just being radicalized, which you are free to be in the United States. You have a constitutional right to be a radical, that's fine. But you don't have a constitutional right to kill people. And so when that switch is flipped, it's too late. So how do we substantively interfere and block that switch in the minds of people here and North America and Western Europe, in the region? It's not the government that's going to do that. The government can facilitate. The government can sponsor. The government can create the right community relations environment. But ultimately, there have to be non-governmental and, in many cases, religious organizations that are going to have to do it.
Okay, but since we're writing a playbook for the next president here today,
You have to reach out to those communities. You have to reach out to the non-governmental agencies, to the religious leaders. And you have to help the messaging people in those organizations by having government activities not be counterproductive to the messaging. Government's very bad at messaging, as you know. So there have to be other organizations that do it, but government can, by messing up, by doing things that are counterproductive, negate all the good work that people do on the messaging side.
Let me turn us to the other big picture question that I said I wanted to frame our discussion with, which is how do we define U.S. goals? I think I threw in the phrase, caught myself saying the phrase, winning the war on terror, which is now, and it feels totally retro to talk about that. But that was the goal for many years, as was fostering democracy and stability in the Middle East. So let me pick up on some of the remarks that you made and flip this to you, Paul. How should the incoming president define what U.S. goals are? And we can stay with terrorism, but I'm also interested in the not unrelated question of the Middle East and what is the U.S. goal?
Well, I'd say if we're talking about national security and the threat of terrorism, which is what this volume is about, the goal is to avoid any attacks on the U.S. Mainly on the U.S. And that is, to a large degree, a homeland security and homeland CVE challenge. But the other part of it is a foreign policy challenge. And when you try to situate the Middle East among the next president's, various pulls on her or his attention in the White House in terms of regions and where U.S. concerns are, when you look at national security for the next 4 or 8 years, yes, there are challenges with Russia and challenges with China, but there is no direct threat to, security of Washington, D.C. or New York or Chicago from Russia or China or Europe or South America or Central America. It is coming from this region called the Middle East. So one big picture question is, as messy as it is and as problematic and as thankless, and as much as any president would love to move, not deal with the Middle East, you'd have to soberly say the only place internationally that there is a serious threat to U.S. security, major city security, in the next months and years is coming from the Middle East. So that immediately says, for the next president, the Middle East, whether they like it or not, is going to be a big concern. The interests, we've mentioned there are several. Some are doing fine. Free flow of oil from the Gulf remains a national security interest of the United States. But it's fine. There's no immediate threat to that. The next president has to keep an eye on it. Weapons of mass destruction, a few years ago, Libya had a program. Iraq was assumed to have one. Iran had one. Syria had one. We are in a world now that only Israel has major, WMD, and the U.S. is not concerned about that. So that interest is kind of taken care of. So we're left with the terrorism threat for the next U.S. president. And there, if one were to try to define goals, I would agree maybe with some of the people who said, well, your goal cannot be utterly eradicating it because that's not realistic. The goal might not even be completely defeating on the ground every terrorist group in the Middle East or Africa and so on. In other words, you might push ISIS out of Mosul and out of Raqqa, but they're going to still be in some of the desert areas or in other places. And that needs to be an okay goal, that you're not going to obliterate them completely. And even if you defeat, which is not realistic, every group in a particular locale, it will definitely live on as a threat and an idea on the internet and so on, and will continue to produce lone wolves throughout. So I think the realistic goal in terms of the Middle East itself is to defeat the main places where particularly ISIS and Al-Qaeda have gained such momentum, to rebuild stability and states in the region. So at least it's 90% states and stability and only 5 or 10% instability. Right now, there are enormous parts of the Middle East which are completely ungoverned, and that's not sustainable, and that needs to be fixed. So I think the goals have to be ambitious but also realistic, and they have to be, as I think General Allen says, it's sort of whole of region approach and whole of government approach. In other words, it's not just drones and special forces. It's also wise policy, de-escalating Iran and Saudi Arabia, helping rebuild states, and encouraging China and others to invest so that people are not ending up being radicalized.
President Obama has said you can't solve ISIS without solving Syria, without bringing at least this truly horrendous phase of conflict there to an end. I wonder, do you agree with that? And what role should the U.S. play in trying to move Syria in that direction?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, in Iraq, you have a problem of ISIS in Mosul, but at least in Iraq, you have a constitution that's inclusive, a parliament, a government, a process, a willingness from all parties to talk and govern together. That is completely absent in Syria and continues to be absent 5 years into the conflict. And definitely many of the recruits to Al-Qaeda or ISIS or other groups, some more or less radical in Syria, their motivation is they're trying to bring down this very, very brutal regime. And obviously the regime has killed way more people than ISIS has or Al-Qaeda will or would in Syria. And it's a main driver, and it's the main driver of the Sunni sense of marginalization, which pushes them sort of to the fringes of Sunni politics, which ends up being Nusra and Al-Qaeda. So yeah, absolutely. Until there is some kind of resolution in Syria, it will be very difficult to eradicate ISIS. But being realistic for the next president, I don't see that the Assad regime and their backers, Iran and Russia, are going to push the Assad regime for any real negotiations. So while that's important, I don't think it's going to happen. I think the realistic option in Syria is the one Emilian alluded to that some of our authors talked about, that whereas I can imagine in Yemen, Libya, and Iraq, a political process and inclusive and new governments and moving forward, in the next foreseeable future in Syria, the best I can see in some of our authors is a de-escalation, cessation, or largely cessation of hostilities from both of the major sides, and more, sort of freezing the Syrian conflict, and in the meantime focusing on pushing ISIS out of Raqqa. They've been pushed out of Dabiq, which is very important. Raqqa is not an enormous town. It's not like Mosul. So it is doable. It's not going to be done under this administration. There's not enough time. But I think for the next administration, it's very realistic to push ISIS out of Raqqa and try to de-escalate and stabilize the Syrian conflict.
Emilian, let me let you jump in on this question of U.S. goals in the Middle East, and what realistically, which is a word I think you just used several times because that's got to be part of the conversation. What realistically, if you could lean down and whisper into the ear of the next president, how would you instruct them to be thinking about this?
So I mentioned earlier that I'm Canadian, and I have a rule of thumb for understanding Canada and the U.S., which is if you take Canada, any number, any stat, any budget or anything, and multiply it by a factor of 10, you pretty much population, budget, anything like that, you get to the U.S. So I will answer that by taking the Canadian approach to this problem and just saying the U.S. should multiply it by 10. When the new Canadian administration came into office, the very popular Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister, withdrew the 6 fighter jets that were part of the coalition supporting Iraq and Syria. In that case, why? Because the U.S. has plenty of capability to do that. The coalition has plenty of capability to do that, and it wasn't the right place for Canada to play. And instead, he focused Canadian resources on training police, training local security forces, which we are specialized in doing, providing humanitarian support, medical support, supply support, and most importantly, accepting refugees and helping with the refugee crisis. So Canada took in 25,000 within 6 months of the new government and is now up to about 35,000 Syrian refugees. So I think Paul's answer is better than an answer I could deliver on U.S. interests. Broadly speaking, I think the piece where several of our authors said, and I think that the U.S. could play a disproportionately times 10 huge role, is in helping to address the refugee crisis and the fact that half of Syria's population is either internally or externally displaced. That is bad for Syria, bad for the Syrians, bad for the countries like Jordan and Lebanon that have to bear that burden. So whether it is through accepting more refugees or providing that times 10, the thing only the U.S. can do, that times 10 economic investment and humanitarian investment to support refugees, I think would not do anything strategic in terms of U.S. security interests in the next 4 years, but it would have a huge long-term benefit. So it's something that the administration can do now for long-term effect.
Let me play off of that, because I think Paul's right. Raqqa is probably not going to be taken in the life of this administration, but it will be in the life of the next. Mosul probably will be taken in the life of this administration. What happens after that? These cities are devastated, or they will be, if the pattern holds. And if we don't stimulate rebuilding and find a way to get the refugees back home, no one will. If we don't take leadership to do that, no one will. The regional players, the Saudis and the Emiratis and others, Kuwaitis, should be contributing significant amounts of money to rebuild those cities. They're not, as far as I can tell, planning to do so. And that's a case where American leadership will be at times 10, because if America ponies up the leadership and the money to rebuild those destroyed countries, destroyed cities, we can lead our regional friends to contribute. We can lead the World Bank and the IMF and places like Japan and others to contribute. Because if we don't, just having moved Daesh out of the city solves no problem. If that city can't be rebuilt, if the refugees can't go home, it will just be a breeding ground for more terrorism in a second or third chapter of terrorism.
Just intervene quickly. These are the issues we have to be talking about. But Dick, you're right. It's going to be a question of resources, and we have not been very good with respect to resources for other than kinetic solutions in this region. And that will be a significant challenge if that is the course that the next president chooses, not only to articulate that, but then to convince the Congress to provide the resources in order to move in that direction.
Quick comment, and then we'll open it to questions.
Yeah, I mean, on this issue of rebuilding and resources, both short-term and long-term investment for jobs and development and so on, I think here's a big opportunity for partnership with China. China has enormous resources. For China, helping rebuild Mosul is something they can do, you know, with the capacities are enormous. Their interest in the Middle East is largely in infrastructure and long-term investment. They've put many hundreds of billions, long-term trillions of dollars in their one road, one belt policy to try to build infrastructure, trade, and investment from China all the way west through Iran, through the Gulf, through Syria, and Egypt, and so on. And they're the ones today who are doing this major long-term investment. We look at the Middle East today or tomorrow after Mosul and so on, it's sort of Western Europe after Second World War. It needs major reinvestment, and the US does not have those resources, nor does Europe have those resources, nor does Russia. And hence, I think China could be brought in to play a very beneficial role in this area.
Seems like a good place to pause and let you all get some questions in. So do we have a mic that's making its way around? I'm going to, if we get a mic up here, we'll try to take, we'll take yours. If you want to state your name, if you have an affiliation you care to share, that would be great.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intel analyst, broadcaster, and a former diplomat. I note that one of the biggest threats is the return of hundreds of Russian-speaking jihadists to Central Asia at a time when all the four despots are about to meet their maker. The question, we have seen borders enduring, and probably when this is all said and done, the Sykes-Picot borders will still endure. And I'm wondering if any of you disagree with that conventional wisdom.
Who wants to take that one?
Well, I won't try to address the Central Asian issue because it's not something that I know much about, but I might say a word or two about the Russian involvement, which is not only in Syria, but also now in Egypt and many other areas. They're thinking in very ambitious terms. And for Russia, a lot of it is about defeating terrorists abroad so that they don't come back to Central Asia or they don't come back to Russia. Many of them are Russians. So that is driving a lot of the Russian intervention. In terms of the borders, I mean, I often say it's not the problem's not with the borders, it's with the orders. In other words, moving the border from one locale to another is not going to solve the problem. There's a profound problem of governance in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in Egypt, some degree, in Yemen. And that relates very much to the tensions you saw in the Arab uprisings, which led to many of these conflicts. I do think the borders of what's called Sykes-Picot borders, the current borders of Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and so on, will endure. But what will be the case within them, the issues of federalism and decentralization. In Iraq, effectively already have an more or less independent region in northern Iraq. There's a question whether the Kurds will have a similar federated region in northern Syria if and when there's some agreement. Question as to whether Yemen will remain effectively united if they ever get through what they're going through now, or will it sort of be so federalized and decentralized as to, So I think the overall borders will remain the same, but that doesn't solve any of the problems of rebuilding order within those spaces. Those problems remain.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am, right here in the red. And here comes the mic for you. Hold on.
Yes.
Ann Pincus, former State Department. My question has to do with the specificity of your plans for Syria, which happen to be obviously paramount now. I heard him say that, yes, it'd be great to get rid of ISIS, but Syria is much more complicated than just getting rid of ISIS, and I would like to know what you would recommend that the new president should do, right away when, hopefully, she's elected. Thank you.
I wondered if we'd make it this whole 90 minutes without politics in the election, and we were close, but not yet. I know. Who wants to take it? Syria, what should...
I'll take a
What should the next
stab. I'll take a
president do?
stab at it, although I'll be eager to hear what Paul has to say. I don't think we can have a policy other than Assad has to go. And there are lots of things that we can do to finish that sentence. Assad has to go and then, but I don't think the United States can hold its head up in the region if it ever changes that policy. And so, it seemed for a moment or two that the Russians were willing to talk about something like that. I don't know if they are, or if that was a feint. But I think the U.S. policy has to be Assad has to go. And that may not be something that happens in the first year or the second year, but I think we need to maintain support for the opposition, and including more military support, frankly, than we've been providing directly.
I mean, yeah, I certainly agree with that wholeheartedly. Assad has to go not only because that should be the U.S. position. Realistically, unless he transitions out or goes in some way, Syria is not going to find a new national pact and any order. As I've indicated, that is unlikely to be achieved very quickly. It needs to remain the main goal. There are other additional goals that are extremely important. One is to basically prevent or slow down or the slaughter of civilians and the suffering that's taking place. We can't just say, well, we want Assad to go, and in the months or years that's taking place, we won't do anything if thousands are being slaughtered before our very eyes. And that's where issues of safe zones, potentially no-fly zones, and putting pressure on the Assad regime and its backers on the issue of humanitarian safety and not slaughtering people and so on, not just the issue of Assad must stay or must go. That is something I think where the Obama administration has failed catastrophically. This is not only I think a moral catastrophe for humanity, as you put it that way, but it's also very destabilizing in the global order to make it okay once again for governments to slaughter their populations. It has a real world impact. So I think realistically, within a long-term strategy of maintaining pressure on Assad and his allies to come to the negotiating table and find a way to transition Assad out, and that's something the U.S. and Russia have been on, have worked on. Russia sincerely is not wedded to Assad himself, but they currently don't see a way to keep their allies in place if he leaves. But there needs to be what has been missing, which has been a robust U.S. policy about safety of civilians, and which Secretary Clinton, if she's president, has talked again about, even in the last debate, about safe zones and no-fly zones, and about being serious about standing up to these gross war crimes that are taking place.
What about arming the opposition? I mean, that's something the U.S. has tried with ups and downs, but working with moderate opposition
Yeah, I
and
think
arming
that's.
them. Does such a thing
yeah.
exist? Moderate
Yeah,
opposition
definitely,
at this point in
it
Syria?
exists. It exists, and it's those who work with these groups know it very well. And that's something that the U.S. knows as well. The U.S. has chosen not to arm the opposition itself in any major way, and wanted to stay out of that ball game. The result is that we've empowered the Assad regime as well as the ISIS and Al Qaeda groups. One of the goals, in addition to Assad must go, protect civilians. The third goal, which is currently the first goal, which we must not forget, is defeat ISIS. Actually push them, from Raqqa and any other main areas, and then shift to the focus of combating Al Qaeda in Syria, which is a very major threat. So that anti-terrorism aspect must remain, and both in fighting ISIS and fighting Al Qaeda, and in putting pressure on the Assad regime not to bomb civilians and to take negotiations seriously, supporting the moderate Syrian opposition is a very main element. We've done that with the Kurds. We support various groups, in Iraq. We support various groups in Syria. I think definitely support for the vetted armed opposition in cooperation with allies absolutely needs to be a major factor.
Okay. There were a couple more over on this side, and then we'll swing back over here. I see two in the middle right here. There's a gentleman and a, yep, if you want to start there, and then we'll come up to the gentleman in the navy and white sweater here.
Hi, thanks. I'm Mike Gerling. I'm a consultant on CVE programs, and I used to work for the UK government in Pakistan. I'm interested in your distinction, Dick, between extremism and violent extremism. In your article in the journal, you make reference to Saudi Arabian and Kuwaiti madrasas not being allowed by their funders to amend the curriculum to include more secular subjects. From your time in government and the other people on the panel, do you get any sense that our allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and others, are starting to share your distinction about this relationship between extremism and violent extremism?
Not sufficiently. I think the Saudis had a turning point several years ago where they seemed to realize that they were creating an atmosphere in which this sort of philosophy was just a natural extension of what they were teaching in the schools. But they're still teaching it in the schools all too often and all too much. So short answer is no.
The interconnection between these issues of sort of radical or extremism, and then they turn violent, and the connection with that with geopolitics, that this violent contest between Iran and Saudi Arabia, if you want to summarize it a bit, goes back to 1979. It has a time frame, and that's sort of the year or the period when we begin to see the weaponization of sectarianism, It has a number of factors. First of all, the Islamic Revolution in Iran claimed that they are a revolution in the whole Islamic world. They want to unseat all the sitting governments, part of their proud ambition. It's in the constitution and so on. And they have a mission to do that. Secondly, they want to stand with all oppressed groups and support them and arm them. And over time, they also want to speak for Shiite communities in addition throughout the region. So if you look at it as a challenge, it's more than what the Soviet Union claimed to do, which says, we're with the people. Yes, they organized communist parties, but they didn't set up, in most cases, armies, that deal with the Revolutionary Guards and so on. So you have the Iranian threat impacting Saudi Arabia. You have, in '79, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, where the US and Saudi Arabia decided to weaponize Wahhabi radicalism in order to fight a geopolitical war against the Soviets. And in 79, you have the takeover of Mecca by a radical Al-Juhayman group, which challenged the Al Saud's radical credentials to govern Mecca and Medina. So you have these three massive threats to the Saudi government, which previously, I mean, yes, it's conservative, as is Qatar, as is many of these countries, but they didn't see it as anything part of their foreign policy. They did a little bit when they were fighting Abdel Nasser, but it didn't really go very far. So what we have now, the Iranians trying to extend their power through Shiite organizations and militias, and the Saudis, one of their methods is to try to respond out of sort of fear in the same way. That's what always leads me to conclude that part of the strategy to diffuse terrorism and so on is you have to diffuse the geopolitical conflict trap that the U.S. helped set up in 79, because the U.S. encouraged Saudi Arabia to contain Iran and fight Iran. They backed Iraq in the war. They encouraged this, Wahhabi thing in Afghanistan. So the U.S. has been part of it. And under the Obama administration, they've sort of left this conflict trap, signed a deal with Iran, and said, well, good luck with the region, deal with it. The U.S. needs to do much more to change it from a conflict system to a stable system, and then it can be an offshore balancer.
Interesting. There was a gentleman with a question right here in the navy sweater, middle row. Oh, right here. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Kevin Meister, recent graduate from Geneva. I recently traveled to Guantanamo Bay to observe some of the military commission trials in the 9/11 case, and I was intrigued to see that one of the detainees had a scarf with Palestine written on it. So it got me thinking that perhaps some individuals are radicalized because they identify themselves with broader ideological conflicts. So my question to you is, to what extent do you think the lack of a political resolution of the Israeli-Palestine conflict has an impact on perhaps individual radicalization and on broader instability in the Middle East? Thank you.
I don't. I think the radicalism that we see has other causes, other roots, other motivations. And unfortunately, the Palestinian cause gets paid lip service. I thought this for years, I thought this before 9/11, that if you look at Al-Qaeda's activities before 9/11, they barely mentioned Palestine. So I think the Palestinian problem needs to be addressed, and that's certainly one thing on the agenda for the next president. I can think of a good person who might be a good special envoy to go out and reopen that process. But I really don't think, if you remove the Palestinian issue altogether, I think the radicalism would not change one iota.
Let me just stay with Guantanamo for 1 second. My follow-up on that, if you're advising the next president, will Guantanamo be open when we all reconvene in 4 years? How do you shut it?
I think it's still an important symbol. I think it needs to be closed. I think there are U.S. supermax prisons that the communities around those prisons have said they're ready to receive. And I think the next president should get people home. That's a legal problem. And then I'll turn to Dick and Rand, who actually served in the White House, for how to handle that.
I agree with you, Amelia, and that would be the solution. The political tension over that particular choice it continues to manifest itself, unfortunately, because we are also limited by our ability to return those individuals to the countries from which they came, either because the countries won't accept them or because we don't accept the country as being able to take care of them in a more humane way, as opposed to simply incarcerating them and perhaps torturing them. So we're caught in that dynamic to resolve this, political at home and problems of sending people. The fact that we sent the Uyghurs to Albania is kind of one of those, does that make any sense? But they were willing to take them, and we weren't prepared to send them back to China. So
I just think that if Barack Obama could do one thing to give a gift to his successor. It might be to defy the Congress sometime in January.
You heard it here first. There was a gentleman in this row, and then we'll make our way toward the back. Just here.
Ray Tanter, the Iran Policy Committee, publishing as former NSC staff in Reagan Bush days. When we talk about stabilizing Syria and for Assad to go, how can we not bring in Iran as the main element that fuels the civil war in Syria? And specifically, Iran, either Iranian-controlled individuals, Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the Quds Force, what Iran does with Hezbollah in Lebanon, fighting in Syria. So I don't think we can have an Iran policy that says that Assad must go, or Syria policy that Assad must go, without introducing the word Iran.
Well, I agree, and that's why I think the various elements of policy have to be taken at the same time, the various layers. When you look at Syria per se, I think you need a combination of things. You need to, first of all, have serious pushback on what the Assad regime, Iran and Russia are trying to achieve, because as long as they think they can win this conflict, even if it costs several more hundreds, thousands killed and millions displaced, they will not stop. And they've proven that, because the U.S. has offered ceasefires, has offered negotiate. They haven't taken it because they feel we can keep going and we can win. They're trying to get Aleppo now. If they can get Aleppo next year, they'll try something else if there isn't pushback. But the second element of that, once you have enough pushback, is the negotiating table. And that largely, that partly is a Syrian negotiation, definitely as to how they want their country to look like and what kind of constitution. But as I indicated, and many of our authors do, and many think tanks in this town emphasize, without really engaging the main regional players, Iran, Turkey, Gulf states, Egypt, Israel, and trying to disentangle this proxy war from this conflict trap to something that all the players can work with. Unless you do that complex work, you're not going to be able to diffuse the civil war in Syria. You're not going to be able to stabilize Iraq or Yemen. So you have to walk and chew gum at the same time. And regional diplomacy is going to have to be a big part of it, including Iran.
All right, we're going to finish with a power round of two. There's a gentleman who's been patiently waiting in the way back, and then I'm going to take last question from you in the front row here. So we'll start with the gentleman, and then before y'all answer, let's hear the next question.
Thank you, Rahim Rashidi with Kurdistan TV. First, what is your advice for the next administration to arm Peshmerga and support Kurdistan? And do you think Iran has supported Al-Qaeda? Thank you.
All right.
Iraq has supported Al-Qaeda or Iran?
Iran supporting Al-Qaeda, are they? Okay, and then let's get your question in as well, and then we can all answer.
My name is Mimi Hassanin, and I'm the liaison for the Middle Eastern community at the Office of Community Partnership in Montgomery County. I'm going to switch from policymaker to community. And as Richard spoke about engaging the community and the interfaith group, how do you see building a relationship and building bridge between the community and to stop radicalizations and through the interfaith and reaching out to the community? As you know, most of the immigrant people do not gonna come close to the government, and the minute they hear the word government, they have nothing to do with it. But I do agree with him, reaching out to to the community and their own faith-based area will be a good goal. Thank you.
Okay, so your question, what specifically they would like to, how do you do it? Okay. Rand, you want to take that one?
Sure. Read the chapter by Miramati in the book, and it's about the Montgomery County model, and she's sitting over here in the audience, which is exactly the model that Dick was referring to, which started as a community-based effort involving both the county government and the Interfaith Council and the organization Word that had a multicultural approach to working with Muslims in the community, and pulled it all together without federal funding or without federal involvement until after they became a sitting effort. And that's the point. The government, particularly the federal government, is perceived, rightly or wrongly, as being part of the problem rather than being part of the solution. So the question is, how do you empower local communities? How do you empower them both to mobilize the effort locally, and how do you empower them in order to find the resources that are obviously a part of that kind of a solution? There are places around the country that this is happening. That's the only one really that's achieved success from the bottom up as opposed to the top down. And that's where the federal government is struggling to figure out how they can do that. The notion is perhaps they can use a grant program rather than direct involvement in the communities so that they can at least provide some seed money out to communities. But the communities themselves have to see the problem as their problem and take it on as their solution.
Paul or Emilian, do you want to tackle the Kurdish TV question about arming Peshmerga and whether Iran is arming Al-Qaeda?
Well, I think U.S. policy towards the Kurds, its broad outlines will continue with the next administration. The Kurds have a very positive, reception, I would say, in Washington. Both the experiment of the KRG in northern Iraq has been a very positive one in general, fairly democratic, fairly secular. And the Peshmerga have done a tremendous job in protecting their own areas against ISIS, but also in this current campaign to help liberate Mosul. The issue of independence for the Kurds, the U.S., I think the U.S. sees the challenge as if there were a pathway for the Kurds to have actual independence without getting into trouble with Baghdad, Ankara, and Tehran, and probably Damascus, they would be okay with it, but they don't see such a pathway, so they advise not proceeding to trying to declare independence in northern Iraq. In Syria, it's obvious that the Kurdish fighters there are a main ally of the U.S., and whether they end up with a sort of autonomous federal zone like in northern Iraq or not, I think the U.S. would be favorable to both options, but they correctly recognize that's something that the Syrian Kurds have to work out with the Syrian opposition and maybe with the Syrian government if and when there is a negotiation. In terms of arming in the Iraqi side, they've largely insisted in order to maintain Baghdad's influence in Iraq's unity that the U.S. not do so much directly with Erbil, but to maintain things through Baghdad to maintain some national unity. As we've mentioned in northern Syria, the U.S. in general hasn't been very proactive in arming and so on, but they certainly have been supportive of the fighting forces there. And I think when the operation to Raqqa gains steam sometime, whether it's at the end of this administration or the beginning of the next, U.S. assets will be used more intensively there as well. On Iran and Al-Qaeda, I think it's not just Iran, it's Iran and the Assad regime. Yes, it's clear that Iran and the Assad regime, particularly when the U.S. invaded Iraq, the Iranian position was, thank you for invading Iraq and removing the Saddam regime, and we'd like you to leave soon. So we're going to help any insurgency which will make you uncomfortable, make sure that you don't stay like you stayed in South Korea or Germany or other places. And they succeeded in that, and the U.S. indeed had left. We have now more people back there now. So yeah, they very consciously used assets in Iraq and making sure the U.S. took the decision not to remain in any major way. And the Assad regime, and I guide you to our colleague Charles Lister's book on the Syrian jihad, the Assad regime has had long links with Al-Qaeda and radicals. They've used them in Lebanon. They used them to destabilize U.S.-occupied or U.S.-run Iraq, and the Maliki government wanted to take Assad to The Hague because of that. And they certainly used them to seed the opposition and to sort of poison the opposition and to make sure that there was a major radical terrorist aspect in the opposition. They still don't really attack ISIS. They've only attacked them in Palmyra. Otherwise, their attacks are all on non-ISIS areas and rebel-held areas. Sadly, Iran and Russia have gone along with that. But that's not to say that the main support of ISIS and Al-Qaeda comes from probably radicalized communities or people who support them from the Muslim world beyond the Arab world, or even from the Arab world in the Sunni world. So yes, Iran and Assad regime have played a role, but so have many other networks.
Thank you. I'm going to bring us to a close by awarding myself a very quick closing question. And I'm going to ask each of the four of you just for a sentence or two. What is the most contrarian recommendation in here? When we all take this report home and spend our afternoon reading it from start to finish, what is going to leap out at us as a surprise, either because it's such a radical departure from what the administration has been doing, or because it's just not something you would ever have imagined recommending 8 years ago? But as we've said, the landscape has changed. Emilian, you want to tackle that first?
I think the recommendation, which came from several authors, including General Allen, that the U.S. has to play an assertive, central, leading role, that there are things that the U.S. can do in terms of leading military coalitions, diplomatic coalitions, economic investment that nobody else can do. And I think that the Obama administration, kind of following on the heels of the Bush administration, has been quite restrained. And I think there's going to be a push and pull for the next president, where some people will lean on them to take great military action. Others will say, we've avoided making the problem worse for the past 8 years, keep that up. And I think that the world needs more U.S. in the Middle East, certainly economically and diplomatically, and that is a little contrarian.
To echo that, if y'all haven't seen it, General Allen, one of the contributors to the report, has an op-ed just out in the Washington Post, of which the headline is, "The U.S. needs to escalate in Syria, needs to escalate the conflict." It's a provocative read, and I'd encourage you to go read it. Paul.
Two comments. One is, I would reiterate, it's not how much you do, but what you do. A lot of the debate we've heard, I'll bomb them, I'll, do this, I'll do that, no boots on the ground. It's about sort of quantity. It's rather sort of use of smart power and using power with diplomacy in an intelligent way. The second thing that, I don't know if it's contrarian, but it's really absent, at least from the political debates, you do see it in the think tanks, is the necessity to address the regional proxy aspect. It used to be the main thing the U.S. did when the Arab-Israeli conflict fueled so many conflicts, and it still does to some degree. The U.S. got it, that unless we resolve Israel, Palestine, Arab world, we're not going to be able to put out fires. What's missing, certainly from the Obama administration, but even in whether Secretary Clinton or candidate Trump, they do not mention the question of what the U.S. should do to de-escalate Gulf, Turkey, Iran, and that needs to be there.
Thank you. Rand.
In the countering violent extremism section, I think it is, and Dick had actually already alluded to this, the U.S. should just get out of counter messaging. The federal government has no serious role or legitimacy to be providing messages to individuals about why they should not take up jihad. Other people may be able to do it, but it's not the federal government.
Dick, last word.
There's a leitmotif throughout the volume that suggests not that the United States should cease being a military power in the region or being more reluctant than it has been in the last few years to use military power, but rather the leitmotif is to balance our military strength with our non-military skills in terms of resourcing and in terms of activity. And I'm reminded of the day that the Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, went to Congress and asked for money for the State Department. I think there's a theme in this book that suggests he was right.
My thanks to all the panelists and to all of you for coming and for smart questions. I think we have a quick final word. Tom, you're going to let us know how we can find the report.
Well, just a quick thanks to the panel for, as impressed as I was with both the nuance and depth here, there's a lot more of it in the volume, so by all means go and read. I wrote late last week, so by all means read it, my own 2-page concise plain language summary of the volume, which is available on that table out there. It's the most bland looking page that you can see. It doesn't tell you what the recommendations are, there's much too much for that, but it tells you what the volume attempts to do and how. So you can pick that up, and again, you can look for the link that we provided on the flyer to access the volume online for free for a short period of time. And my understanding is that this video is going to be up on the MEI website, I think even tomorrow. So thanks to all of you. Thanks so much for the volume and for this panel, and have a great day.